Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Okay, dear listeners, my friends, if I may be so bold, I gotta apologize. I know it's been a minute since the last episode. Unless, of course, you're just listening to these in the future, in which case this episode is coming out exactly according to schedule, and there's no need to double check the dates because I thought we were friends and you can trust me. Now, we've talked about music on the podcast before, and we've hit the genres that seem to be the usual suspects when it comes to controversy. A little bit of punk, some rap, and even some metal thrown in for good measure. This week, though, we're going to be talking about country music. Now, to be fair, country has had its fair share of outlaws, for sure. You've got Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson, but also folks like Merle Haggard and Hank Williams. Fun fact, Hank Williams was actually so outlaw that we don't even know what state or year he died in. On October 31st, 1952, he hopped in a car with his driver, who was appropriately named Charles Carr. He was on his way from Nashville, Tennessee to Canton, Ohio for a concert. He had in his system what would ultimately be a lethal combination of chloral hydrate, alcohol, and morphine. Some of it prescribed by a doctor, some of it self-prescribed, and some of it, according to legend, given to him by a man pretending to be a doctor. Carr would stop for a fill-up in Oak Hill, West Virginia, sometime after midnight, where he found Hank Williams had sadly passed away. Where and when exactly would be forever lost to music history. But as outlaw as these guys were, for my money, I would give it to Lavender Country any day. You see, Lavender Country released their first album, which was self-titled, in 1973. And it was the first openly gay country music album. Lavender Country was the brainchild of lead singer and guitarist Patrick Haggerty. It consisted of himself, keyboardist Michael Carr, no relation to the aforementioned Charles Carr, singer and fiddle player Eve Morris, and the band's only straight member, guitarist Robert Hammerstorm. Now, here comes this week's trigger warnings. We will be touching on homophobia, artistic references to rape, and references to mental illness and ableism. So, let us go back to the beginning with this one. Patrick Haggerty was born on September 27th, 1944, and was raised on a dairy farm in Washington, near Port Angels, by Aslida and Charles Haggerty. They were a Catholic family, and he was one out of 10, count 'em 10, siblings. According to him, quote, "I was scrawny, I was small, I was tiny for my age, I was a sissy," end quote. On his relationship with his father, Haggerty tells this one story that I think just about sums it up. When Patrick was a sophomore in high school, he got it in his head that he would run for pep promoter, which was basically head cheerleader. He was being driven to school that day by his older brother, and he starts putting on all this glitter and lipstick, and his brother is like, "What the hell are you doing?" To which Patrick simply replies, "I'm putting on my costume." So his brother drops him off at school and thinks, "I'd better tell Dad. Patrick is being weird." So Patrick's dad, Charles, shows up at the school and starts walking up and down the halls. Patrick sees him and quickly ducks out of the way. Later, after the assembly and after Patrick took off his costume, his dad came and picked him up from school. And the two of them are driving home, and Charles says, "I thought I saw a kid look just like you duck around the corner when I came down the hall, but I knew it wasn't you because you wouldn't duck out on your own dad." Patrick started to get nervous. Patrick's dad, Charles, continued, "Were you proud of yourself with that lipstick and that glitter? Were you proud of yourself?" Now, at this point, Patrick didn't say anything because he couldn't. He had no idea what to say. Then his dad reminded him, "You know that I'm dying, right?" And Patrick said, "Yes, Dad." And then Charles said, "And you know I'm not going to be here when you're a man to help you through this stuff." And then Patrick said, "I know." And then this is what Patrick said his father said next. Quote, "Well, I'm going to tell you something right now, and it may not mean anything to you now, but it will mean something to you later, and I want you to remember it. Whoever you run around with when you go to the University of Washington Drama School, don't sneak like you did today. Because if you sneak, it means you think you're doing something wrong. And if you spend your whole life sneaking, you'll spend your whole life thinking you're doing the wrong thing. And you'll ruin your immortal soul. So don't sneak." End quote. As Patrick puts it, quote, "Of all the things in 1959 a father could have told his gay son, my father tells me to be proud of myself and not sneak." End quote. Patrick would often say that he had the patron saint of dads for sissies as he got older. Sadly, Charles would pass away about 2 years later on October 29th, 1961, at the age of 60. Now, despite having a father with what we will call historically astronomical, unlikely levels of acceptance for 1959, Patrick's life as an openly gay man would not be all sunshine and rainbows. After college, he would join the Peace Corps, but would be discharged in 1966 for being gay. And then he would end up in a mental institution for the same reason. All of this mistreatment in his personal life, combined with hearing the news of the Stonewall riots, had pushed Haggerty to become a self-identified radical. Some quick historical background that I'm sure you already know, but let's just cover our bases. One of the most defining moments of the 1960s was August 15th through 19th of 1969, and it would go down in history as the crowning achievement of the hippie generation. I'm, of course, referring to Woodstock, 3 days of peace and music. But less than 3 months prior, and about 2 hours down the road, there was an even more important piece of history going down in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood in Manhattan, New York. To set the stage, in this time, homosexuality was still considered illegal in 49 of the 50 U.S. states. Fun fact, it was Illinois that was the only state where homosexuality was legal, having repealed their anti-sodomy laws in 1961. In New York, a series of gay bars had begun to spring up. These would serve as safe havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and identities, or at least safer havens than the streets outside, where they faced harassment and violence along with the threat of Johnny Law coming down on them for the simple crime of just being who they were. Even inside these safe havens, there was still the threat of extortion for many, and more than the occasional raid from the police. Stonewall Inn was one of these bars. It was run by the mafia, and they bribed cops to look the other way. Not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart, but because by creating a safe space for gay people, they could overcharge their clientele. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn, and patrons had decided that they had enough. 9 police officers entered the bar. They began to try and arrest customers and bartenders alike. Many in the crowd were not intimidated, and they resisted. Outside on the street, people began to pick up what was going on inside the bar, and they began rioting by the hundreds. Eventually, the police had to run and hide, locking themselves into the bar. The crowd responded by setting the bar on fire. By this point, there were thousands on the street, rioting. Backup was called, and they were able to retrieve the 9 cops locked in the bar, but the riots would continue until July 1st. It should be noted that the Stonewall riots have a deep and rich history that I'm only scratching the surface of right here, and it's worth looking into for yourself. It should also be noted that this was not the first act of the gay rights movement, but it was a watershed one. Now, there are a variety of reasons for why that is, not the least of which being is it brought on the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, who are considered by many to be the prime catalyst for the gay liberation movement. They were also the group that Patrick Haggerty would join upon leaving the mental institution and moving to Seattle. It was there that Haggerty would form the band Lavender Country and release the band's 1973 album, Lavender Country. The recording was bankrolled and released by the Gay Community Services of Seattle, a group founded by activist Fagil Ben Miriam. That name is Hebrew, and much like my Italian accent, you'll have to just forgive me. Fun fact, Miriam was also one of the first people in America to file a lawsuit after being denied a same-sex marriage license. Sadly, it would be overturned. The album contained these 10 songs: Coming Out Singing, Gypsy John, Waltzing Will Trilogy, Georgie Pie, Crying These Cocksucking Tears, Back in the Closet Again, I Can't Shake the Stranger Out of You, To a Woman, Straight White Patterns, and Lavender Country. Now, admittedly, there's a certain tongue-in-cheek vibe to the titles of these songs, especially Crying These Cocksucking Tears. And to be sure, there's definitely humor on this album. But on the whole, it's a deeply and surprisingly earnest album, even with songs like Cocksucking Tears. It is an album about the joy and pain of being openly gay in the 1970s. Waltzing Will Trilogy takes on the mental health institution that at the time would use electroshock therapy to cure homosexuality, and the police who would beat gay men to death, and the prison system where guards would rape them. And that's only one song. Back in the Closet and Straight White Patterns take on living in a culture dominated by the so-called morality of straight white men and straight white men alone. And I Can't Shake the Stranger Out of You, a song about the ease of having sex, but the difficulty of being in a deeper relationship within the gay community at the time. Lavender Country performed at the very first Seattle Pride event in 1974, where Haggerty recalls being blown away at the turnout of 350 people. They would also perform at many other Pride and LGBTQ festivals through Washington, California, and Oregon. They even got some radio play. DJ Shan Ottey of KRAB had the audacity to play Crying These Cocksucking Tears on the station in 1973, which would lead to the FCC pulling her broadcasting license. When asked why she played the song, knowing it couldn't be played and that she would get in trouble, she simply and beautifully responded, quote, "Because I thought it should be played on the radio, and I had the ability to do that," end quote. It should be noted that Shan Ottey has carved her own piece of history over the years. She started as a pirate radio enthusiast in Philadelphia, centering her broadcasts on protesting. Pirate radio, for folks about my age and younger, was simply people who decided to broadcast without a license. The upside, you could say whatever the fuck you wanted. The downside, it was in fact illegal. Fun fact, these laws came from the 1912 Act to regulate radio communication, which in turn created a brand new federal agency dubbed the Federal Radio Commission in 1927, which was then succeeded in 1934 by the Federal Communications Commissions, aka the FCC, who would go on to become very upset about Janet Jackson's nipple and oddly give Justin Timberlake a complete pass. But that wouldn't be for several years. Back to Shan Ottey. She was actually at the Stonewall riots before moving to Seattle and becoming a late-night radio host at KRAB. Not only did she host, but she also advocated for women in radio by holding seminars to help women become licensed sound engineers. And though she had got the boot from KRAB, they would invite her back before too long, and she would end up staying with the station until 1982. Some highlights of her radio career include broadcasting one of the first American gay and lesbian radio programs with Paul Barwick in 1971 called, quote, "Make no mistake about it, it's a faggot and a dyke," end quote, and went on to produce shows for the Lesbian Feminist Radio Collective. It also should be noted that her and Haggerty were close friends. There were 1,000 copies of the Lavender Country album pressed. This is the olden days, so we're talking about actual vinyls actually pressed. They were advertised in the back of gay underground magazines of the time. Just send $4.50 to the address and they would send you back the Lavender Country album. They would go on to sell all 1,000 copies, and after that, as Haggerty puts it, quote, "We had no more records to sell, so Lavender Country died," end quote. The band disbanded in 1976, only 4 short years after its creation. Haggerty would go on to try for political office twice and become a gay rights and anti-racism activist. He also became a family man with a loving husband and some kids. And so Lavender Country was no more. Until Chris Dickinson, staff member of the Country Music Foundation and editor of the Journal of Country Music, wrote a piece in 2000 for that very publication titled Country Undetectable: Gay Artists in Country Music. And that article heavily featured Haggerty and Lavender Country. She also saw to it that the album was archived at the Country Music Hall of Fame. This renewed interest led to a re-release of the album on CD and a brief reunion of the band playing both Seattle's Broadway Performance Hall in January of 2000 and at that year's Seattle Pride. But as quickly as the interest sparked, it seemed to fade away again, leaving Lavender Country to fade away again into the annals of country music history. Until, that's right, dear friends, there's 2 untils this episode. YouTube came along and someone uploaded the infamous Crying These Cocksucking Tears. The link would eventually come across the desktop of Jason Green, a music critic for Pitchfork, who said, "How do you not click on that?" After getting over the title and listening to the song, he had this to say about it. Quote, "He is a sad sort of human, interesting figure in this song. And what I discovered was that this record is a really human record by an incredibly interesting person who was like a person alive on his own record. And that's a really rare thing. It's where I felt like the more times I listened to this strange little 10-song record, the more I knew Patrick Haggerty as a person." Brendan Greaves of the record label Paradise of Bachelors also heard the song via YouTube and had this to say about it. Quote, "It was evident just 30 seconds in that there was something more going on here and that it wasn't just like a gag song," end quote. Paradise of Bachelors would do a reissue of the album in 2014. This time, it was not only on CD, but on MP3 and vinyl, as well as a 32-page chapbook. And it seems like the third time was the charm. Haggerty is slowly but steadily being recognized and remembered as the brave trailblazer that he was and still is. You heard me right, dear listener. Patrick is coming out singing again. With revolving band members, Haggerty spends his days playing straight country songs, no pun intended, at old folks' homes, and nights playing along local Seattle punk bands at dive bars and other venues. While not a huge fan of the punk music, Haggerty sees the punkers as his people, and by his own admission, he can always just turn off his hearing aid, and that helps. Haggerty recorded a story for something called Story Corps, where he detailed coming out to his father in 1959, to his now grown daughter, which would in turn be adapted into the animated short film The Saint of Dry Creek in 2015, both of which I highly recommend. There will be links down in the show notes, and even though having listened to this podcast may have given away the story, to hear Patrick Haggerty tell it will take you on such an amazing emotional journey that I could never replicate. The album even inspired a ballet. In 2017 and again in 2019, Robert Decker's Post Ballet Company staged a modern ballet performance of Lavender Country, choreographed by Vanessa Thiessen and performed at the Z Space Theater in San Francisco, with Patrick Haggerty himself performing live with his new Lavender Country lineup. In 2019, the band released Black Rose and Other Songs and Sorrows. It was their first full-length album of brand new material since the original Lavender Country dropped 46 years prior in 1973. And just this year, 2020, Trixie Mattel, drag queen extraordinaire, winner of the third season of RuPaul's Drag Race, and singer-songwriter, featured Haggerty on her cover of Can't Shake the Stranger Out of You, appropriately titled Stranger, for her album Barbara. Haggerty told Trixie in an interview she did with him that the original title of the song was Can't Fuck the Stranger Out of You. And when I first heard him say that, it did give me a chuckle, but then I started singing back the song in my head with that lyric and the understanding of what that one word change gave to it. And it just suddenly gave me a fresher understanding on a really visceral level of how deep and layered that song really was. And I think really that is the beauty of Patrick Haggerty and Lavender Country. I mean, if you set aside for a moment the bravery, the rage, the sadness, and the joy, and the honesty, which all ring so true and proud on this album. But the music has a way of pulling you in with something you think is going to be tongue-in-cheek, but smacks you with tracks that are anything but. In some ways, it's ironic. These Cocksucking Tears was the track that Haggerty himself thought would forever block him from Nashville. It would ensure that his music career would go nowhere. And it may have done just that. For a few decades anyway. Eventually, Crying These Cocksucking Tears would be the song that pulled him back from obscurity and cemented his place not only in gay history, but in the history of country music as well. Look, I'm not going to lie. The research fades for these episodes can be slightly brutal from time to time, depending on which episode I'm doing. But this episode was just so nice to watch these interviews with this really underappreciated living legend brought tears to my eyes and joys to my heart. And I mean that literally. And to listen to these songs that stand the test of time. One of my favorite lines is actually from the song Lavender Country itself. It says, quote, "You all come out, my dears, to Lavender Country. You all come out and make yourselves at home. It don't matter here who you love or what you wear, 'cause we don't care who's got what chromosomes." End quote. And if you ask me, that is more magical than anything Hogwarts ever had to offer. So put that in your turf pipe and smoke it, J.K. Rowling. Oh, and speaking of magic, one last thing before I go. In my humble opinion, there is a place where you can experience the type of magical, amazing wonderfulness that the song Lavender Country promises. And that place is the Burlesque Hall of Fame Weekender, held every year in beautiful Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, in my day job, my company has had the honor of recording and editing the showcases for the last 7 years. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart when I say it has been life-changing. The Burlesque Hall of Fame, who throws the Weekender every year, is a museum and an organization dedicated to, quote, preserving, sharing, celebrating, and inspiring. They, like many other folks, have had a rough go through this pandemic. So if you are on a lookout for an organization to support, or even if you're not, go check out www.burlesquehall.com. The link will be in the show notes. The work they do, not only for burlesque, but for LGBTQ, feminism, and so much more, is phenomenal. And you could not ask for a more honestly run organization. Also, just a personal recommendation for this week. If you are interested in more history of gay representation in media, go check out Matt Baume's YouTube series, Culture Cruise. It is positively phenomenal. Again, links in the show notes. Final fun fact, I'll miss you, friends. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you next time. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach, and And please like, comment, subscribe, and if you donate blood, come join our Band Media podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.